responsible for the budget speech that we are going to hear now. Enoch Godongwana joins me from Cape Town. Minister, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. I'm going to start on that very contentious point of the 2 percentage point VAT hike, which was initially rejected. Now, a smaller increase is understood to be on the table. Does this compromise or weaken your fiscal strategy?
Good evening, Xoli and listeners. Let me start by saying I don't know whether you did read the speech, what is the so-called leaked speech, so that the conversation between the two of us becomes simpler. Did you read it?
I did, Minister. Yes, I did.
What were we intending to fund? What were you intending to fund with that 2%?
I missed your point, Minister. Just expand a little bit.
What were we trying to achieve and fund with that 2%?
The understanding is that you are trying to make sure that the SRD grant, in part, is what is or should be funded by that VAT increase. Am I correct?
No, that's precisely. I can see part of the difficulty is the conversation is always in the public domain, focus on the 2% VAT. It is not on the revenue side. It did not focus on the expenditure side. In other words, what we're intending to fund, the SRD is but one of the things to make it permanent moving forward. But a lot of other items were supposed to be funded in that budget. We listed quite a number of them, including education, health, defense, or correctional services, to list but a few. And if you ask me, who particularly on health and education are we funding? We are funding the very poor people, people saying will be in a difficult with a VAT increase. But let me just say that's past. People objected to the 2% VAT increase, and we've gone back to the drawing board.
If that VAT proposal does not return, my question still stands. Does that weaken your fiscal strategy?
I cannot comment about the fiscal strategy I'm going to table on the 12th. I'm going to table a fiscal strategy on the 12th. It's for you to judge when I do that, whether that fiscal strategy is weakened or not. I can only talk about the past. I can't talk about the 12th.
Okay. Well, let's talk about what you have told the Sunday Times. And reading that paper today, you are reported to have been surprised by the strong reaction from your fellow ANC cabinet colleagues at their rejection of the VAT proposal. Why do you think they pushed back so hard?
I would have probably think that intuitively everybody was shocked with the amount that I've proposed. Let me take a step back. On the 4th of February, I tabled the budget in Cabinet. In that budget, I said, here is the normal budget. However, this budget is unworkable in the sense that a number of items who are going to cost about 112 billion rand over the MTF, some of them critical, will not be funded. I then highlighted a number of options, including tax revenues, and eliminated a number of these taxes, including companies tax and income tax, and left with VAT. And a couple of colleagues commented on that, on VAT, because I didn't put an amount. It was too far from the budget day because once you do that, the potential for leaking was strong. So I didn't attach a number on the 4th. So people then were shocked with the percentage.
And so some people will translate that to deep divisions within the ANC on fiscal policy. How would you respond to that?
My response is that there's no division in the ANC on fiscal policy at all. The fact that there may be a division on a number or one thing, it does not mean a division from strategic thrust. What is that strategic thrust? The strategic thrust, we must make sure that we, as the ANC, make sure that the things that affect our poor people are properly funded. On that strategic thrust and the fiscal policy in that direction, there's no dispute. What would be in dispute is how do we fund that, and what are the tax proposal or mix of taxes you can utilize to achieve that objective.
Let's talk about the corporate tax, the tax hikes that you have ruled out. And this includes scrapping the medical tax credits. Now, with limited options on the table for you, Minister, unless, of course, the options are in abundance, where will additional revenue come from?
Let me say, I don't know about the medical credits. What I do know is that I've made a proposal that if you look at our corporate tax, it's higher than the OECD average. In other words, compared to all the OECD economies, which are bigger economies, our tax to GDP is higher than those countries. Now, it's higher than the African continent, higher than anybody. What that means, South Africa as an investment destination becomes uncompetitive. Now, we may choose to do that if we want. What complicates matters is that we also have an increased electricity price. Secondly, we've got logistic challenges. If you go to the mining industry at the moment, no one is making money. All you'll be doing, a number of councils, Glencore, for instance, is closing about 7 furnaces, which will affect about 13,000 employees. All you do by imposing a tax in that environment, you're actually frustrating the unemployment process.
What about income tax? Do you believe that we have also reached the same ceiling as in corporate tax?
I'll just give you an example. There are 16 million people that are employed in South Africa. 7 million pay taxes out of the 16 million. 7 million pay taxes. Here is going to be another figure which should worry you. 47% of that income tax, 47%, is paid only by 490,000 people. Now, if you want to put more burden on these 490,000 people, is to increase income tax on them. So you've got to make all of these are the difficult choices a Minister of Finance makes. It's not an easy decision to choose an option, but I'm saying these are the difficult choices as a Minister of Finance you have got to make.
And I'm glad you touched on that, Minister, because many South Africans are frustrated with these tax increases, some believing that some of the money is lost to corruption. What do you say to those who feel that they're paying more but are seeing very little return for their money?
That's a different conversation which I agree with. That's a different conversation that I agree with. If we are saying before I sort a problem in a particular hospital which does not have equipment at the moment, I must wait for until such time we've dealt with corruption, it's a daunting task. It's a major thing to ask. I'm saying these things at the same time. Let's deal with corruption where it exists. The problem with corruption is everybody else says there's corruption, but it's difficult for someone to say, yeah, the corrupt activities, yes, the money that we need to be pointing, you need to be collecting. I'm more than happy to work with people to achieve that objection of dealing with corruption.
I'm glad you're very short, Minister, in your responses.
An example, our colleagues...
Sorry about that. I thought you had completed your thought. A phrase has been used, been used to say South Africa is at a tax inflection point where increases do more harm than good. Is that where we are before we take a break?
I suspect we're closer to that point. I did point out where we are in terms of carbon tax. I did point out how limited the income taxpayers are. And that, to me, is also a challenge. No Minister of Finance, by the way, want to increase taxes. Minister of Finance want on budget day to stand up and say, I'm giving you your tax, I'm giving you revenue back, and your money back. So that's what you know. This choice of going for a tax is an unpalatable choice to make.
All right, Minister, let's take a pause there. When we return, some of what we're going to talk about is departments, including municipalities, returning monies to Treasury when service delivery on the ground is nowhere near being dealt with. That conversation continues. You're watching News at Prime. If you're just joining us, we're in conversation with the Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana ahead of his budget speech on Wednesday. Minister, thanks for staying with us. You have warned that more budget cuts could erode basic services. Question is, are deeper structural changes needed to balance the books?
The major problem you face as a nation is a growth problem. So for as long as the economy is not growing, we're going to face these challenges. Let me just give you an example. If we are talking about debt to GDP, you asked why people are not worried about Italy, are not worried about Japan, and so on. Because no one is worried about those countries' debt to GDP is more than 100%. Because those economies are growing at a pace in which they can afford to service their debt. So our major problem is a growth one. So part of what we're trying to achieve, we should be striving for, is a growth issue. What we were tabling last time on the 19th was precisely to deal with issues using structural reforms and also investing more on infrastructure. In fact, if you read that speech, it's going to tell you we're saying, in fact, economic classification, was the fastest growing over the medium term at 8.9%. So not only were we funding the poor, we're also funding infrastructure to invest in growth. And that's why we had this point of having 8.9% growth over the medium term. Without that investment in growth, we are going to have a challenge.
Yeah. So we have a growth problem, yet there are programs that still remain, even though they were a temporary measure. Let's talk about the SRD grant. It is still in place. Is it financially viable? And if so, how will you fund it if the VAT is not going to be forthcoming?
Let me make the point. It's not to counterpose this RD in that form. In an environment where there's no growth, a number of people fall into the unemployment because your employment becomes structural. The key question, how are you going to do to mitigate the impact of that unemployment? So there's an argument for the SRD. But my argument is, if that is the case, which is a noble cause, what we need to do is to find a revenue source for it. And in the absence of finding a revenue source, you are going to have a problem. It's a structural unemployment. You cushion the impact of structural unemployment, but let's find a revenue source to do that.
And perhaps that's what you're going to tell us on Wednesday, Minister. I can't push you more on that. Every year, some departments return monies to National Treasury, much to the frustration of South Africans who want services. What is Treasury doing to prevent this kind of mismanagement? Because that's what it is. It's mismanagement.
It may not be mismanagement. It may be a capacity issue. If you look at largely what is being returned are infrastructure grants and infrastructure money, which may relate to the ability of executing infrastructure in government. So you will see in the medium-term budget policy statement in October, we make this point that what we need to be doing now in focusing on infrastructure, we've got to make sure we assist in improving planning. We must also assist in improving execution. That is exactly what we plan to do.
Let's talk, Minister, then about the budget delay, with many suggesting that cost-cutting measures, such as scrapping the deputy minister positions, ministerial perks, there are these other funding sources that can be found when you make the argument, for example, about finding sources of revenue to fund things like the SRD grant. Are these options on the table to scrap deputy minister positions, including some ministerial perks?
Those are above my pay grade. It is the president's prerogative to appoint ministers and deputy ministers. But let me make the point about the budget. Even if the president were to decide to use this prerogative and cut deputy ministers and ministers, that's optics. You can save about 30 million at most. What we require is more than 30 billion per annum. So in that sense, it's optics to sound nice to the public, but it won't solve the fundamental funding gap.
Including the SETAs that the Democratic Alliance, your GNU partner, is talking about. Would that also fall under optics?
It may well be that our GNU partners do not follow probability discussions in government. Let me make the point. We have agreed that we have got to do a reorganization of all the active labor market instruments that exist in government. We have agreed to do that. Set up a team to do exactly that purpose. The sitters fall within that category, and a report is going to be tabled in September. Now, you don't simply do all of these things because you've got a legislative framework. It's unlike in Trump, where we can issue an executive order and everything happens. Those things exist in terms of the law. For you to change them, you've got to also change the law. The proposal that will come in September will also say what legislative framework that needs to be changed. There's nothing difficult to do that. When we're dealing with FATF, we provided an omnibus bill where we could change a number of legislative pieces of legislation at the same time. But that outcome will come in September. So that's why I'm saying I don't understand our DA colleagues when they do not follow that specific debate in cabinet.
The other relationship that we ought to bring to the table is that of the relationship between yourself and the SARS commissioner. Should South Africans be concerned?
Not at all. The commissioner and I, we have known each other even before our existing positions. So in that sense, it's not a problem. If we have a clash on a differences on a minor irritation such as this one, which is the first, by the way, and probably the last, I don't think the South Africans should worry about it. By the way, we've had a series of meetings since then. Sunday last week, Tuesday this week, and in addition to that, to give you an example, he was hosting some ATAF, which is an executive of all taxpayers on the African continent. He is the chair of that. He asked me to show face, which I did, and we had a nice occasion, and we took a picture. He even said, how I wish the business day was here to take a picture. So I'm saying there was one incident which I think we should not blow out of proportions.
All right. Let's conclude then, Minister. How confident are you that the budget speech will go ahead on Wednesday?
I don't want to second-guess cabinet, other than to say I rely on the statement issued by Minister Ntshavheni, which says cabinet deliberated and agreed that I should go and put together a budget, taking into account the comments and the various options that were proposed by my colleagues in cabinet. Other than that, I can't say anything else.
That's a very, very interesting comment. Do you mean to tell us that there is no consensus, at least at the moment?
No, my understanding, that's why I'm saying if you read Minister Ntshavheni's statement, was that in cabinet was some sort of an agreement which summarized, and I was asked in the light of those comments to put together a budget which I'm going to table to my colleagues before I go to present it to Parliament on Wednesday.
All right, parting shot. GNU partners want more say in the budget decision-making process. Is Treasury being forced to share power, or do you believe that this is mere politicking or perhaps political interference?
No, I think no one would like to be part of the day-to-day details of constructing a budget. I would imagine that people would be more interested in the policy space in that discussion and what policy trade-offs are being made. One of the interesting things about this postponement was to stimulate a debate in society about policy trade-offs, because part of what has been absent is this debate about policy trade-offs. what do you fund with what? How do you raise revenue? And all of those things, what to cut, all of those things are policy trade-offs, which I think my colleagues in the GNU would like to be part of that kind of discussion.
Minister Enoch Godongwana, I want to thank you very much for your time tonight and best of luck on Wednesday. Hopefully we'll see you in Parliament.